They found him alone in the corner of the infirmary, breath-thin eyes half open, as if watching something no one else could see. A Templar knight armor stripped away dignity barely hanging on, and clutched beneath his robe was a parchment no one could explain. Not a prayer, not a confession, a warning, a vow. Words written in a shaking hand that claimed the order had guarded a secret so dangerous, so catastrophic, that revealing it would shatter the foundation of Christendom itself. You look at that last line ink smeared with sweat and fear, and you wonder the thing he must have seen in his final hour, and why he died, still trying to hide it. But dramatic final moments only tell you so much. The breath steadies, the pulse slows. You ease into a quieter rhythm because the truth behind a prophecy like this never rushes. It waits patient and heavy in the corners of forgotten rooms. Imagine yourself walking through the dim stone corridors of a medieval commandery long after the candles have burned down to their stubs. The air carries that faint mineral chill found only in old places, the kind that feels older than memory itself. Somewhere inside those walls, hidden beneath centuries of dust and habit, lies the story you're about to unravel. A story whispered between dying knights, buried under lost chapels, encoded into strange star maps, and sworn upon by men who believed the world would end if they ever spoke it aloud. You let your hand trail along the cold stone as you move deeper, feeling the tiny imperfections left by long-gone masons. It's oddly comforting, a reminder that history is never clean. It scrapes, it cracks, it hides. And sometimes, if you listen closely enough, it mutters secrets like someone talking in their sleep. The parchment found beneath that dying knight wasn't an isolated curiosity. It was one piece of a pattern, one that stretches through black-robed suborders, forbidden pilgrimages, coded speeches, vanished manuscripts, and visions recorded by men who swore they weren't dreaming. As you settle into the slow cadence of this investigation, you can almost sense the enormity of what the Templars believed they were protecting. Something they expected to outlive them. Something they feared would return. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. You breathe in. The dust settles. The story opens its eyes, and the prophecy waits for you just as it waited for them. You've seen the images, white mantles, red crosses, the classic regalia of the Knights Templar. Purity, piety, and public righteousness stitched into every thread. But in a few rare cases, accounts surface that disrupt this picture entirely. Chronicles half dismissed by church historians describe black-robed figures participating in midnight rituals far from the eyes of kings or cardinals. These weren't enemy infiltrators. They were Templars. Not renegades, not excommunicated deserters, but full brothers. Trusted, initiated, and wrapped not in white, but in something much darker. There's a passage from an obscure 14th century Flemish chronicle that tells of a knight in black standing watch during the trial of Jacques de Molay. No one recognized him, and yet no one questioned his presence. The chronicler described him as cloaked in shadow, but bearing the cross like a guardian from a forgotten chapter. The detail would have faded into footnotes, if not for another reference, this time in a confiscated Templar journal recovered during the Avignon Inquisition. The journal belonged to a knight stationed in Aragon and included a single entry scrawled hastily into a margin. The black-mantled met again this moon. The seal remains unbroken. No explanation, no elaboration. Just that. Templar statutes required strict uniformity. The rule of the order based on the Cistercian code mandated white for knights, brown or black for sergeants, never black for full brothers. And yet over time, fragments accumulate tombs with black-robed effigies, stained glass depictions in chapels tied to Templar enclaves, and even whispered oral histories in parts of Portugal where the order quietly endured. Some historians argue these accounts represent confusion with other orders or regional misinterpretation of vestments. But the problem is pattern. Too many sightings, too many symbolic links. A 19th-century antiquarian named Émile Montfort documented an altar cloth preserved in a collapsed Templar chapel in Burgundy. The cloth featured an embroidered black cloak enclosing a serpent coiled into the shape of a cross. Some dismissed it as forgery, but Montfort noted the stitching technique matched the 13th-century French liturgical style. No one could explain why a serpent, a symbol of heresy, would appear in a Templar chapel, or why it was protected beneath an image of a darkened mantle. One of the more compelling connections emerges from an overlooked footnote in the records of Pope Clement V. During the papal review of the Templar trials, a certain prior of Toulouse referred to those among the brothers who walk the midnight path. It was struck from the official record, but survives in the inquisitorial draft notes. The phrase returned centuries later in a curious place, a Masonic ritual from the Scottish Rite that describes keepers of the midnight path as guardians of a sealed vow passed through blood and fire. This term, midnight path, has taken on a near mythic aura among esoteric researchers. Some interpret it metaphorically, a spiritual reference to navigating the darkness of the soul. But others believe it was literal. A faction within the Templars, bound by an oath distinct from the rule of the order practicing rites, meant not for spiritual elevation, but for preservation. Of what exactly remains the central question, and here is where modern scholarship starts to fray at the edges. In 2006, archaeologists excavating ruins beneath a former Templar site near Tamar uncovered fragments of charred cloth tucked into a sealed reliquary. Chemical analysis revealed traces of iron oxide and oil-based dye ingredients historically used to color fabrics black. Alongside it was a medallion tarnished but intact, bearing a four-pointed star within a circle. No known Templar insignia matched it, but one curious parallel exists. A similar star design appears in pre-Christian Iberian cult artifacts, most notably among the Vetones, who believed in deathless guardians watching over time-bound seals. Coincidence, maybe. But the order rarely left things to chance. This is where earlier accounts return, drawing fresh attention to the black mantle not as mere variation, but as designation. One 13th-century song preserved in oral Galician tradition speaks of riders of the Veil Knights who do not greet the sun and who drink from the second cup. Scholars once believed the verse referenced Moors, but the symbolism feels off. The second cup, that imagery appears in apocalyptic Christian texts and in certain Kabbalistic rituals, both highly irregular for a Catholic military order. Unless, of course, they weren't entirely Catholic, or not entirely under the Church's eye. Now the question emerges, were these black-robed figures simply a symbolic order within an order, a brotherhood, tasked with guarding something separate from Jerusalem relics or crusading glory? If so, then the cloak wasn't just a garment. It was a warning, a marker of proximity to something the white-cloaked brethren swore never to approach, unless they too were chosen. And yet the Church itself seemed aware, at least partially. The Council of Vienne never directly addressed the Midnight Path, but it issued a peculiar condemnation shortly after a ban on cloistered nocturnal assemblies of military friars. Only one order fit that vague description, and only one had the means and secrecy to maintain such gatherings. The Black Cloak becomes more than a historical curiosity. It becomes a shadow trail, one that snakes through forgotten vaults, encoded messages, and whispered oaths. And as you trace it, one detail lingers. Every account of a black-robed Templar ends the same way. No face remembered, no name recorded. Just a figure at the edge of the firelight watching, waiting, guarding something they believed would one day matter far more than their name. The records you're about to follow weren't supposed to exist. They weren't transcribed in Rome or ratified in Jerusalem. They lived in the shadows, scratched into margins, copied in cipher, whispered under stone arches. And yet, if you map the surviving fragments together, they trace the outline of something bold, almost unthinkable, that a faction within the Templars answered, not just to the rule of Bernard of Clairvaux, but to another order entirely. One older, one hidden, one that called itself the Rule of Sion. Most of the public knows Sion through modern myth-making, the Priory of Sion, Dan Brown novels, Holy Blood conspiracies. But centuries before it became the punchline of pop esoterica, the term appeared in serious documents, most notably in a suppressed set of French ecclesiastical complaints from the early 1200s. These complaints, filed quietly with the Archbishop of Narbonne, accused certain Templar preceptors in the Languedoc of placing foreign laws above those of Bernard and of referencing a Mount of Sion, not of the earth, but of the watching flame. That odd phrase, the watching flame, wouldn't mean much alone. But it surfaces again in a vastly different setting, an inquisitorial confession recorded in Toulouse in 1244 during the Albigensian purges. A captured Cathar perfectus claimed the Templars were twice bound, sworn once to Rome and once to a flame that sees but does not burn. Heresy, maybe. Or maybe the Cathars, who believed in two worlds, one of light, one of shadow, recognized something in the Templars that the Church refused to see. It's here in southern France, amidst the collapse of the Cathar strongholds and the brutal efficiency of the Crusade, that we begin to see patterns. Several Templar commanderies in the region offered covert aid to Cathar communities, despite papal mandates. Some scholars write this off as political maneuvering alliances of convenience against the rising power of northern France. But the consistency of aid, the strategic placement of fortified farms, and the reappearance of certain symbols, especially the double-rayed cross and the tower in flame motif, suggests something else. One such symbol appears carved above a forgotten doorway at Château de Montségur, long believed to be the last Cathar refuge. The carving, almost worn to invisibility, shows two robed figures flanking a flame rising from an open book. Beneath it, in cramped Occitan, the inscription reads, "For Sion does not sleep, though Rome may turn its gaze." In 1987, during restoration work at a remote Templar chapel in Bézieux near Rennes-le-Château, archaeologists uncovered a series of mural fragments behind a false wall. One panel showed a black-robed knight handing a sealed codex to a hooded monk, bearing a golden staff, not a bishop's crozier, but a shepherd's staff, carved with star markings. In the corner of the panel was a symbol historians had long debated, a downward triangle pierced by an upward flame. Theories range from alchemical signs to Masonic proto-symbols, but a recent re-evaluation ties it to a far older glyph found on a Sumerian tablet, referencing the keepers of the flame without end. The implication that the Rule of Sion referenced not a geographic location, but a lineage of guardianship stretching back long before the Templars absorbed into their ranks by design or by necessity. This theory gained traction in the early 2000s, when a researcher named Carlotta Munier uncovered letters exchanged between a Templar knight named Raymond of Arles and a mysterious figure known only as T.S. The letters, preserved in a private family archive in Carcassonne, reference the inheritance of flame, a sealed site in stone, not meant for this age, and an oath older than Solomon's tomb. Strangely, none of the letters discuss military campaigns, relics, or Rome. Their focus is singular, guarding the threshold. And then there's the Black Chapel. Located beneath the ruins of a monastic compound near Collioure, the chamber was rediscovered in 1994 after a series of landslides exposed a hidden stairwell. The chapel, though modest in size, was constructed with volcanic stone, not native to the region. No Christian iconography adorned its walls, only a single motif repeated along the cornice, a torch flanked by two crescent moons. Beneath the altar, researchers found a stone basin filled with resin and charred parchment fragments. Carbon dating placed the remains between 1180 and 1210, exactly the period when the Templars were consolidating power in the region. What stood out most wasn't the chamber itself, but a phrase etched into the arch above its entrance, Custodes Sionis in Silentio, keepers of Sion in silence. The mainstream position holds that Sion, if it existed, was a literary device, part of Crusader romance or monastic metaphor. But that view becomes harder to defend when physical evidence, inscriptions, and ritual continuity start aligning across centuries. Templar documents from Poitiers, long buried in Vatican archives, reference a second rule allowed only to those who endured 3 veils. The phrase 3 veils also appears in the initiation rites of obscure Renaissance brotherhoods, claiming descent from Templar survivors, who describe a ceremony involving darkness flame and a final vow never to name the fire. It's not just poetic language, it's codified silence, the kind you find in groups that know they're playing with something dangerous. And here's the thing, no Templar ever stood trial for invoking the rule of Sion. Not officially, but references to alternate allegiances, non-sanctioned rites, and foreign oaths pepper the trial transcripts. They're always vague, always dismissed, but always there. The deeper you go, the more one quiet possibility begins to echo louder than all the rest, that the Templars were not the originators of the Black Prophecy, but the stewards. That they did not create the flame, only swore to keep it from burning the world too soon. It begins, as many mysteries do, with an omission. Hugh de Payens, the co-founder and first Grand Master of the Knights Templar, is one of the most consequential yet curiously underdocumented figures of the medieval world. Despite leading the order through its foundational years and shaping its sacred rule, his surviving words can be counted on less than a single parchment's worth of ink. No speeches, no sermons, not even a personal letter. Just scattered references, official signatures, and second-hand descriptions passed down by chroniclers who seem to revere him more as symbol than man. That silence has always felt too convenient. It wasn't until the late 19th century that a curious document surfaced in the archives of the Château de Gisors, a letter unsigned and undated, attributed by some to Hugh de Payens. Written in Latin, its phrasing deviated from the formal ecclesiastical tone of known Templar correspondence. Instead, it was terse, urgent, a voice less concerned with politics or doctrine and more with concealment. The letter, addressed simply to the Brothers of the Hidden Path, warns of an awakening in the Western flame and speaks of guarding the Black Seal with unblinking resolve. It was dismissed as apocryphal by early scholars, likely a Masonic fabrication, they said, or a literary hoax. But in 2003, forensic analysis of the ink revealed a compound consistent with early 12th century scriptoria. The parchment matched Iberian stock from that same era. No one could explain how a 19th century forgery acquired medieval ink and skin. The contents of the letter are less explicit prophecy and more encoded directive. It urges the recipients to let the rule shine for kings and cardinals, but let the oath beneath it burn only for the blind. The use of dual language, light for public rule, fire for secret oath, suggests a deliberate duality in Templar governance. It raises an uncomfortable question. Did Hugh de Payens knowingly build a 2-layered Order 1 for the eyes of Christendom? and one for something else entirely. A monk named Brother Theobald, writing from the Abbey of St. Mary of the Valley of Jehoshaphat in the 1130s, recorded a curious tale of a Templar knight who arrived bearing words from Hugh and requested a secluded fast in the Mount of Olives. The knight never named was described as haunted, carrying dread behind his tongue. After 3 days in silence, he vanished, leaving behind only a scrap of parchment with the phrase "Malachim, come not to guide, but to judge." Malachim, the Hebrew term for angels, was not common among Templars, and certainly not among Latin Christians. Yet the phrase turns up again centuries later in alchemical texts linked to the Rosicrucians, who claim their origins lie in the fire of Paeans. The historian Jean-Luc Salvetti proposed in his 1998 monograph that Hugh may have spent significant time among Jewish mystics before the Council of Nablus in 1120. He notes strange overlaps in early Templar inscriptions and Merkava traditions, esoteric Jewish teachings focused on divine chariots, angelic hierarchies, and apocalyptic thresholds. While unprovable, it adds another whisper to a growing chorus that the order's founder absorbed far more than just Christian asceticism during his time in the Holy Land. And then there's the matter of the rule's redaction. The original Latin rule of the Templars, formally approved at the Council of Troyes in 1129, was a modified version of an earlier text. The existence of a primitive rule, the UR text composed by Hugh and his early companions, has long been speculated. Only fragments survive quoted in later commentaries, and curiously an Arabic translation found in a cache near Saft. This version includes several anomalies, such as a passage referencing the fire that walks between days and a ritual described as washing the crown of the dead king. Neither phrase appears in the later rule. In fact, both were actively denounced in 13th century ecclesiastical records as phrases unfit for Christian tongues. One phrase, however, stands out above the rest. It appears only once buried in a tract from a Templar outpost near Antioch. "We do not serve the tower of stone, but the tower of flame, and its hour has not come." That line, curiously enough, matches a verse found in the so-called Damascus Scroll, a Dead Sea text discovered in the mid-20th century, dated centuries before Christ. The idea that Hugh de Payens was somehow familiar with pre-Christian esoteric texts remains implausible unless such texts were preserved in Jerusalem, beneath the Temple Mount, in the very place the early Templars made their headquarters. Now imagine that possibility laid bare, that beneath the sacred ground where Solomon's temple once stood, something was found, not a relic, not a weapon, but a manuscript. A document that spoke not of past revelation, but of future consequence. And Hugh perhaps reluctantly became its first modern steward. That might explain why his public record is so sanitized, so vacant. Not negligence, not loss, but erasure. The few hints that remain describe him as grave withdrawn and deeply committed to a mission he never named. Unlike later Grand Masters who engaged with royalty and popes, Hugh retreated after the Council of Troyes. His final years are shrouded in ambiguity. Some say he died in Palestine, others in France. No grave has ever been confirmed, but one account preserved in a Burgundian necrology lists his name next to a strange epitaph, Custos Ardens, the burning keeper. We return then to that lost letter. Whether Hugh wrote it or not, whether the seal it references was metaphor or object, the impact is the same. A founder cloaked in silence, with eyes turned toward a future not yet written. A prophecy not shouted from the pulpits, but guarded in the margins. And an order whose very foundation may have been poured not only in blood and vows, but in fire. You notice it first, not in manuscripts or church records, but in stone. In the corner of an unassuming grave slab in a ruined Templar cemetery, near Sintra, Portugal, a shape so weather-worn that most would miss it altogether. A horse crudely carved with eyes like hollow voids and flared nostrils turned toward something unseen. Its tail is not raised for battle but drooping, and beneath one hoof, etched in the faintest relief, is a broken circle interrupted deliberately. The motif appears again hundreds of miles away, in a different grave, this one hidden beneath a collapsed floor in a chapel once controlled by the Order of Christ, the post-Templar Portuguese successor. Same blackened horse, same broken seal. What does it mean? Most modern Templar symbolism revolves around familiar imagery, crosses, swords, the dome of the rock. But the horse, especially the black horse, is an anomaly. Some speculate it refers to the four horsemen of the apocalypse, with black symbolizing famine and imbalance. Yet the biblical horse carries scales, not a broken seal, and no official Templar emblem includes any version of it. This suggests not theology, but code. In 1721, a Jesuit archivist named Esteban Faria discovered a scroll wedged into the spine of a crumbling ledger from the time of King Denis of Portugal. The scroll included a poetic riddle in Old Portuguese referencing the rider who bears no banner, who gallops only where names are buried. It was unsigned, but sealed with dark wax bearing a horse's head. Historians at the time dismissed it as apocalyptic metaphor, but recent examinations of knight tombs throughout Tomar, especially those dated after 1314, the year of Jacques de Molay's execution, reveal recurring variations of this equine symbol. Always faint, always hidden. You start to suspect a pattern, and then something else emerges, something buried deeper. In 1981, Portuguese construction workers excavating a foundation near the Convent of Christ struck a small chamber with no entrance. Inside was a collection of personal effects: rosary beads, a dagger, a folded robe, and a piece of wood carved with concentric rings. At its center, again, the horse. But this version included a new detail, a tear carved just beneath its right eye. Nearby in charcoal on the wall, someone had written in Latin, "Et quando aperuit, sigillum non fuit, vox sed ventus." And when the seal was opened, there was no voice, only wind. It mirrors Revelation almost too perfectly. But the phrasing is off. No trumpet, no angel, just silence and motion. Something had begun, and yet nothing had spoken. Religious scholars suggest it points to a Gnostic interpretation of apocalypse, not the divine wrath of heaven, but the slow uncoiling of fate through silence and consequence. If the Templars believed such a thing, they couldn't say so openly, which is why perhaps they turned to the symbol of the black horse, a creature that in some traditions carries not death, but memory. A minor Templar charter from 1278 housed in a faded archive in Coimbra makes an offhand reference to guardians of the sixth seal, a phrase unique in the order's literature. The sixth seal in Revelation is the one tied to cosmic disturbance, earthquakes, blackened suns, blood moons. But there's no clear reason for a knightly order to anchor itself to that particular moment, unless they believed something had already begun. The blood moon wasn't metaphor, it was marker. Link this to the strange text discovered in 1957 in a hollow pillar of the Sé Vella de Coimbra. The text, half riddle, half instruction, names the black horse as the watcher of the veiled tomb and calls it a beast whose sleep marks the boundary of waking. Again, not standard Christian eschatology, but something far older, possibly Persian, possibly even pre-Zoroastrian, given the similarities with firewatcher myths found in Central Asia. And here's where it gets uncomfortable, because the black horse also appears outside of Europe on a clay medallion unearthed in Acre during a 19th century excavation. The medallion was never linked to any known Crusader heraldry, but its style matches Templar craftsmanship and the inscription in Latin translates to "Ride not west unless the sky turns." One theory suggests it refers to celestial alignment, an eclipse perhaps, or planetary conjunction. Another posits a veil of time itself. Some accounts claim the Black Horse appeared in Templar dream rituals recorded in the marginalia of certain libellus precum books of private devotion. A ritual known only as the Fifth Night was said to involve fasting isolation and a vision of a rider bearing no face approaching from behind in absolute silence. The dreamer, upon awakening, was forbidden from writing the vision's full details. Instead, they were to mark their cloak with a line of black thread, invisible unless closely inspected. One brother, a knight named Alphonse of Evora, left a letter to his niece in which he described having the dream after a week of seclusion in Tamar. He said only this: he did not speak. He did not stop. But I wept as he passed because I knew his coming meant the oath was still alive. The oath, the seal, the rider. Was the Black Horse a warning, a confirmation, or simply a symbol passed down like a shadow of something no one dared speak aloud? As you gather the pieces, you begin to see why the Templars may have turned to animals and riddles. Truth too dangerous for words finds its way into form, into motion, and into silence. The seal of the Black Horse might not be an object at all. It may be an event, a convergence, a return. And those who bore its mark on tomb, on robe, on wood, did so not to proclaim it, but to remember it. Because some seals aren't meant to be broken with fanfare or flame. Some just fade open. The castle rises above the hills, like something half-remembered from a dream. Walls weathered by centuries' cloisters, cloaked in silence, and the great round church of Charola, standing like a relic carved out of another world. Tomar, Portugal. One of the last and most secretive Templar strongholds. It's a place where the past doesn't just linger, it waits. And somewhere beneath its hallowed stones, they hid something more enduring than gold or gospel, an archive that never officially existed, and that even now resists being known. Official histories speak only of transition. When the Templar order was dissolved in the early 14th century, King Denis of Portugal, shrewd, cautious, and perhaps unusually well-informed, refused to burn the bridges Rome demanded. He created a new order, the Order of Christ, and transferred Templar properties, personnel, and privileges into this fresh vessel. The Church blessed the move, grateful for quiet resolution. But not everything made it into the records. Something stayed buried. In 1894, a local historian named Gaspar Azevedo wrote of a rumor passed down through generations of Tomar monks that beneath the convent's old wine cellars lay a sealed chamber inaccessible except through a passage not made for horses or men, but for silence and purpose. He dismissed it as legend. But a century later, in 1992, during renovation works after minor earthquake damage, workers uncovered a narrow stone shaft concealed behind a false wall. The shaft was vertical, pitch black, and it led downward farther than expected. When a team of archaeologists and historians descended, what they found was not a crypt, nor a treasure vault. It was something quieter, stranger. A space barely large enough for 6 people to stand. The walls, tiled in obsidian-colored stone, held no images, only lines. Hundreds of them etched with impossible precision. Arcs, intersections, spirals. A few seemed random. Others resembled star maps, but no one constellation matched the patterns. At the center of the chamber, a stone pedestal, and on it, a single box. The box was octagonal, carved from dark cedar banded in iron. No locks, no hinges. But the top was sealed with a wax impression so old and brittle it had to be photographed before it crumbled. The seal, a horse again. Head bowed, hoof raised. Beneath it, a cracked sun, inside parchment, dozens of sheets preserved in dry air wrapped in oilcloth. The writing, dense-coded, was unlike any formal Latin or even known cipher. It resembled shorthand, but spiraled outward in circular formation. At first glance, undecipherable. Over the next decade, linguists and cryptologists worked quietly to analyze the pages. Only a handful of words emerged, names mostly, not of people, of things. One name repeated 6 times: Presidium Nigrum, the Black Guard. Another phrase scrawled at the edge of the final sheet: Custodia Solis Nascens, guardian of the rising sun. Strangely poetic for knights sworn to secrecy. And yet the language may not have been solely symbolic. In 2011, a team cross-referenced architectural diagrams of Tomar with the chamber's orientation. What they discovered changed the tone of the investigation. The lines etched into the chamber walls weren't random, they aligned with solar movements. Each spiral terminated at a point corresponding with the rising sun on specific solstice days over a 400-year cycle, which means the chamber was more than archive. It was clock, or compass. The implication is staggering: a hidden chamber beneath a Templar fortress, designed to mark time on a cosmic scale, filled with coded documents and sealed under the symbol of a bowed horse. This wasn't about keeping records. It was about waiting, watching, marking the right moment. One academic from Coimbra proposed that the documents form part of a larger ritual, a kind of celestial countdown referenced only obliquely in Templar trial confessions. In one particularly chilling testimony from a French knight named Gérard de Nîmes, he speaks of the chamber that moves, not yet turns all, and of the watchers of flame who cannot sleep until the hour of the breaking sun. The Inquisition at the time dismissed it as delirium. But placed in the context of Tamar's subterranean room, the testimony reads differently. Like a man trying to describe something both literal and symbolic, using only the language he was allowed. A curious feature of the chamber often goes unmentioned in popular accounts: the acoustics. Researchers who entered it noted a strange phenomenon. Even the softest whisper echoed clearly, yet never beyond the room. It was as if the stone drank the sound while letting it fill the space. Some compared it to Byzantine whisper domes. Others felt it more like standing inside a throat. And that brings us to the final clue. Etched into the threshold above the shaft, nearly erased by time, was a single Latin phrase: Et vox erit umbra. And the voice shall be shadow. Why a voice? Why a sun? Why a seal that waits here? The story brushes once again against prophecy. One of the recovered parchments included a date far from the others in a different hand, squeezed into a corner almost as an afterthought. Solstitium MMX7 Summer Solstice 2027. Why that date? Some scholars speculate it aligns with certain planetary convergences. Others believe it may coincide with the full activation of whatever the chamber was counting down to. But the truth is, no one knows. The Church has never acknowledged the chamber officially, nor has the Portuguese government opened it to the public. The documents remain under lock and analysis, their translation slow, incomplete, and perhaps deliberately so. Because there's something chilling about a chamber that watches the sun rise across centuries, something unnerving about documents written in spirals that mimic the movement of stars, and something deeply unsettling about the idea that the Templars, in the twilight of their suppression, were not simply hiding truths of the past, but preparing to trigger something buried in the future. They arrived as pilgrims, or so they claimed. 9 knights unaccompanied by priests, scholars, or scribes. No mission from Rome, no official charter. Just men of faith, they said, asking only for the right to protect fellow travelers on the dangerous road to Jerusalem. But almost immediately, something in their behavior betrayed a different intent. They didn't patrol the roads. They didn't guide caravans. Instead, they occupied a section of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, then thought to be built atop the ruins of Solomon's Temple, and began digging. Not fortifying, digging. You picture them under torchlight, dirt-stained and hollow-eyed, unearthing layers of forgotten earth. Not for gold, not for relics, but for something else entirely, something written. The story of the missing manuscript begins here, deep beneath Jerusalem's ancient platform in vaults and tunnels older than memory. Chroniclers of the First Crusade say little of this phase. It's only in later documents, letters, confessions, and travelogues that strange details emerge. The most telling comes from a 12th century traveler named Nasir al-Din, a Persian merchant who claimed to have bribed his way into the Templar-occupied zone. He wrote of foreign warriors crouched like monks beneath the dome, whispering over parchment blackened by age and smoke. He describes a scroll so long it required 2 men to carry it, yet fragile enough to disintegrate at a touch. No copy of this scroll exists. No clear description survives. Yet scattered references across centuries suggest that something was indeed found, then hidden, then lost. In one archived letter from a Templar preceptor in Outremer, the phrase non scriptura, sed preceptum, not scripture, but a command appears. Not doctrine, not prophecy, a directive, a trigger. The first major mention of the scroll after the Crusades comes not from the Holy Land, but from Provence. In the early 1300s, a Templar knight under interrogation, named Guillaume de Lautrec, spoke of a letter from Jerusalem, written in tongues none could read, but passed to all high masters. He claimed it contained not laws, but instructions for when the world darkens. The Inquisition dismissed him as mad. Yet the phrasing repeats in unrelated records, especially among ex-Templars who fled to Portugal and Scotland. Their oral tradition begins to form around a scroll of division, something that divides not lands or titles, but truth itself. In 1536, a Jesuit historian named Hernando Luis de Torres uncovered a document in Toledo describing a ciphered gospel of unknown origin, written not to convert, but to restrain. It claimed that whoever possessed the scroll would see through kings, walk in silence among storms, and know the hour of division. It's easy to dismiss this as poetic mysticism until you consider that the document was housed not in a monastery, but in the vaults of the Inquisition itself. Guarded, classified, never released to public view. Even more unsettling are the reports from the Ottoman period, when Jerusalem came under new rule. In 1652, an Armenian monk named Serovpe of Van wrote a cryptic passage in his travel diary after visiting the Temple Mount. The wind here sings too deeply. It hides what the Latin knights carried away, but not all. Not all. This phrase would be meaningless except for one chilling resonance. In the vault beneath Tomar in Portugal, among the spiraling documents retrieved in the 1990s, the phrase not all, appears in Latin. Same spacing, same emphasis. This suggests a network of signal phrases, breadcrumbs left, to identify those who had encountered the manuscript or its fragments. A manuscript too dangerous to destroy, too powerful to release. The question, of course, is, what could it have said? One theory posits that the scroll was an alternate gospel, something not aligned with the canonical four, nor even with Gnostic traditions, something entirely outside the theological architecture of the time. A gospel not of salvation, but of anticipation, warning of a future convergence. Another theory claims it wasn't religious at all, but astronomical. A predictive document, one mapping celestial alignments, earthquakes, societal upheaval. Not fortune-telling, forecasting. a kind of temporal equation written in symbol and code. The scholar Maria Vasquez, in her controversial 2009 book, The Eye of the Vault, suggested the scroll may have been written in the Enochian alphabet, a 16th century language claimed by occultist John Dee to be angelic. Dee himself wrote of a lost commandment that predated Moses, stored beneath the sacred platform in the place where gold turns to salt. While dismissed as mystical rambling, the language lines up with the Templars' penchant for adopting symbols that predate Christianity. Perhaps the most chilling possibility is this, that the manuscript didn't originate in Jerusalem at all, that it was hidden there by others long before the Templars arrived, Judean priests, Babylonian exiles, Essenes. Or older still, if true, then what the Knights discovered wasn't a message meant for their time, but for ours. Several contemporary researchers believe the scroll may have contained a warning tied to the year 2027, the same date found etched in Tamar's subterranean chamber. A solstice alignment. A moment when a particular pattern in the sky mirrors one recorded long ago. What the pattern represents, no one agrees. Some say it marks the return of a lost influence. Others believe it signifies a rupture in the veil between what is known and what has been hidden. There is no surviving image of the manuscript, no translation, only silence. But silence has a texture, a rhythm, and in this case, a direction. The scroll has not been seen in over 700 years, but the trail it left through whispered phrases, duplicate carvings, mirrored timelines suggests it still exists. Not in a museum, not behind Vatican walls, but passed hand to hand, line to line between those who swore not to protect its contents, but to await its appointed hour. You may never read it. But if the Templars were right, if they were not the authors but the gatekeepers, then its meaning will not need to be read, only felt. He stood in fire, but he did not burn. That's what one chronicler wrote of Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar. Bound to the stake on an island in the Seine, March 1314, the smoke thick around his feet, he spoke not of regret nor mercy, but of return. According to witnesses, his final words were neither curse nor prayer. They were a riddle. Let evil be judged before this year ends, he said. And then something stranger, something few recorded in full. A phrase short and sharp, what was sealed shall stir again. Centuries later, a coded version of that speech, one that had never been officially archived, surfaced in the private collection of a Milanese antiquarian. The document bore no seal, no date, and no author, yet it was written in medieval French in the same dialect spoken at de Molay's trial. At first glance, the page was gibberish, a spiral of letters, no punctuation, no clear breaks. But when researchers rearranged the spiral as a grid and read only the diagonal columns, something emerged. A message. It didn't read like a confession. It read like a directive. Guard the black flame. Trust not the altar of stone. The lion and the crescent shall bind. In the third eclipse, awaken. Now pause. The reference to black flame had appeared before in whispered Cathar verses in the chamber beneath Tamar, and on the banner found buried in a Templar tomb outside La Rochelle. But the addition of third eclipse, that was new and unsettling, because it suggested a timeline, not metaphor, sequence. Cross-referencing lunar eclipses visible in Europe during the late Templar period, researchers identified three major events occurring in relatively short succession: 1290, 1302, and 1314. All three happened during phases of critical Templar political maneuvering. But 1314, de Molay's death was the final one. That could be coincidence, or it could mean that what they feared had already been set in motion, hidden in plain sight. The idea of an encoded speech would be easy to dismiss if not for supporting evidence. In 1611, a Jesuit scholar named Raffaele Tassi discovered a marginal note in an Inquisition ledger describing a ciphered utterance delivered by the Templar master and recorded by the Italian. No one knows who the Italian was, but the phrase matches an anonymous codex held in the Biblioteca Nazionale in Florence. That codex, bound in goatskin and mislabeled as a treatise on metallurgy, contains a series of poetic stanzas, each beginning with "He stood in fire." Some believe it was a form of ritual recitation. Others think it was a memory device, oral encryption used when writing became dangerous. Either way, the stanza ends the same way every time, but in ash he whispered the time. Ash, time, fire. What was de Molay trying to pass forward? Another clue emerges from the letter of a Dominican friar present during the execution. He wrote that de Molay's lips moved even after the flames took him. "I saw no sound," he said, but his face did not close. It was as though the flame became his breath. Dramatic, perhaps. Or perhaps he had memorized something meant to outlive his flesh. This brings us to the Black Book of Chinon. Discovered in the Vatican secret archives in 2001, the Chinon parchment details Pope Clement V's secret absolution of de Molay and several other Templar leaders. The Church absolved them privately, while publicly burning them. The hypocrisy is staggering, but buried deep in the parchment's Latin script is a peculiar phrase not repeated elsewhere in church documents. Retiniant verba obscura. Let them retain the dark words, not confess them, not destroy them, retain them. And so perhaps they did. One recurring element in Templar iconography, particularly after 1307 when arrests began, was the subtle use of mirrored writing. Words etched backward into stone columns, inverted crosses, not of mockery, but of redirection. This motif appears especially in the remnants of the Monsonès commandery in southern France, where the chapel ceiling bears reversed star maps pointing not to the night sky above, but to one that will reappear again in the future. Even more curious is the discovery made in 2007 by cryptographer Léa Morant, who used de Molay's known prison cell dimensions as a cipher key. Applying a polyalphabetic substitution to the surviving quote from his execution speech revealed a consistent pattern. Every seventh letter, when isolated across multiple copies, formed the word revenir, return. Coincidence or meticulous code? The Templars, unlike the Church, were fluent in delay. They had centuries to wait. Time didn't threaten them, only the forgetting did. And so they built their prophecy into repetition, misdirection, symbol flame. Not for believers, for successors. The term martyr's cipher only entered circulation in the late 19th century, thanks to a fringe circle of Rosicrucians who claimed lineage from Templar survivors. Their internal initiation rites included a passage allegedly sourced from the pyre. It described a vow to speak only when three signs converged: when the moon eats the sun, when the tower of flame sings, and when a name long buried walks again. Vague, undoubtedly, but curiously resonant with the spiraling code from Tamar, and with the phrase carved into the entrance of the sealed vault, "The voice shall be shadow." Perhaps that's the key. Jacques de Molay did not scream as he burned. He encoded. And if what he passed on was not a confession, but a signal, a kind of spiritual dead man's switch, then the real judgment he invoked has not yet arrived. It waits, like flame beneath ash. It surfaced not in a vault or a monastery, but in a charred leather satchel pulled from the belly of a wrecked ship off the coast of La Rochelle. The vessel had burned to the waterline, its name erased by time and fire, But among the ashes and timbers they found it a strange map, brittle with salt and soot, hidden between layers of folded sailcloth. No one knew what to make of it at first. It didn't show land. Not exactly. No coasts, no borders, no compass rose. Only a series of geometric spirals radiating from a central point, punctuated by glyphs that matched no known alphabet. And at the center, written in the neat, deliberate hand of a disciplined scribe, Anno Tractus, Pax Obscura, Iter Nondum, Year of the Pulling, Peace in Darkness, Journey Not Yet Begun. The document became known as the Heretic Map. Scholars debated its authenticity for decades, and many still do, but its presence aboard a vessel almost certainly connected to the fleeing Templars, one that burned while attempting to escape the arrests of 1307 places it within a timeline too precise to ignore. Add to that the fact that the symbols on the map, once dismissed as gibberish, were later found carved into stone at the base of the Corolla in Tamar and scratched into the floor tiles of Rosslyn Chapel. And the question becomes not whether the map is real, but what it was guiding them toward. One early interpretation suggested it represented a mystical pilgrimage, a kind of spiritual diagram, a path through sacred states of awareness. But in 1974, a group of astrocartographers reanalyzed the shapes and proposed something more concrete. The map wasn't of land at all, but of time. Each spiral, when mapped against astronomical alignments, seemed to mirror planetary conjunctions over a 700-year cycle. The glyphs, when reoriented to match the position of stars on key solstices, suggested markers not of locations, but of moments, events, windows. The Heretic Map, in that view, wasn't showing where to go. It was showing when. The most prominent spiral ends at a point marked by a doubled symbol, two crescents facing each other with a single black line between them. That exact symbol reappeared centuries later in an alchemical manuscript known as the Codex Umbrae, which describes the folding of light and age under the twin moons. While poetic, the concept has eerie echoes in modern physics, gravitational lensing, temporal convergence, things the Templars could never have understood. Unless they were passing forward something they didn't write, but merely carried. The Church denounced the Heretic Map as Gnostic blasphemy after a copy surfaced in Avignon in the 1470s. A Dominican inquisitor named Berengar d'Asnières condemned the glyphs as instruments of time sorcery and the map as an invitation to seek the forbidden road. Yet no theology could explain why symbols from the map kept reappearing in Templar enclaves centuries after their suppression, always in places tied to the rumored black-mantled faction. More puzzling still is the map's reverse side. Faint, almost invisible until exposed to ultraviolet light, lies a grid of numbers, 13 rows, 13 columns, beneath which is scrawled in Latin, numerus est servus horarum. The number is servant to the hours. Most dismissed it as numerology. But in 2008, a physicist named Renata Gilardi input the number grid into a frequency analysis model used for seismic prediction. The pattern aligned with cycles of solar activity and magnetic reversal events with uncanny precision. That led to a bold and unsettling theory that the map wasn't spiritual at all. It was predictive, a kind of early warning system for disruptions in the natural order, climate, energy, even consciousness. In this context, the term heretic takes on new weight. The map wasn't heresy because of what it showed, but because of what it implied. That time could be read like a script, that there were moments meant to be acted upon, and that someone long ago wanted to track when those moments would return. A peculiar corroboration comes from the trial records of Bertrand de Blanchefort, a lesser-known Templar who died before the main purge. In one account, he claimed knowledge of a scroll that maps the day of the lion's silence and the serpent's scream. Scholars assumed metaphor. But those same animal symbols appear in Templar carvings in Scotland, and Cyprus always paired, always inverted lion beneath serpent above. This inversion matches a cycle on the heretic map's second spiral. And then there's the final mark. Near the lower corner of the original artifact in ink that had half vanished from water damage was a single date, 2106-2227, summer solstice. The same date marked in Tamar. The same solstice referenced in the ciphered calendar. And the same point where, according to the heretic map's final spiral, the cycle completes just before beginning again. If the Templars believed this map was authentic, if they preserved it, encrypted it, even died for it, then they believed something was coming. Not a war, not a messiah, but a window, a change, a shift they couldn't stop, only measure. And if that's true, then the heretic map wasn't a relic. It was a countdown. It did not begin with a battle, nor with a crusade, nor even with a blessing. It began with silence. In the spring of 1213, a group of Templar knights departed from a commandery in the Auvergne region of France, reportedly on a sanctioned pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela. But they never arrived. No records of their passage exist along the usual pilgrimage roads. No donations to monasteries, no entries in abbey guest books, only one fleeting mention in the log of a Cistercian abbey near Zaragoza. 10 riders, cloaked and quiet, asking no blessing, gave silver but no names. Rode west, not to Compostela, but beyond. They were never heard from again, but traces remain. A century later, a Franciscan friar mapping forgotten hermitages in northern Portugal came across a crude shrine on a wind-swept plateau above Bragança. It was made of piled black stones, unmarked except for a single iron spike driven into the center. On it, a faded scrap of cloth, blackened and threadbare. Beneath it, carved into the bedrock, were 3 words in medieval Latin: transitio in tenebris, passage into darkness. It would be easy to dismiss this as one of the countless solitary devotionals scattered across medieval Europe were it not for the strange alignment. The shrine, though primitive, was positioned precisely along the axis of the setting sun on the summer solstice, and the hilltop itself was known locally as Monte dos Guardiões, Hill of the Guardians. The oral tradition in the nearby village held that once men without names came here and vanished into the mountain. They weren't wrong. In the early 20th century, a landslide exposed a narrow crevice beneath the hill. Local archaeologists found it led to a naturally formed cavern within which were signs of deliberate modification, smoothed walls, shallow niches carved into the rock, and deep at the back, a collapsed stone doorway sealed with mortar bearing the faint impression of a Templar cross. Just beside it, in charcoal, the year 1213. Inside that sealed chamber, once it was safely opened, was no treasure, no altar. Just a circle of stones blackened by fire and a single slab inscribed with geometric spirals. The spirals matched almost perfectly the central glyph from the heretic map. So why were Templar knights on a path that ended not at Compostela, but in this forgotten mountain? One answer comes from a letter found in the Abbey of Mont-de-Marsan. Dated July 1213, it is written by a Templar named Ponce d'Artois to a fellow knight in Tamar. The letter speaks of a summons not from man, but from symbol, and warns that the road west is not of penance, but of preparation. He ends with a phrase that will later appear in the ciphered texts found beneath Tomar. We must light the mirror from the western gate before the veil thins. The western gate was not metaphor. It was a location. Possibly this very cave or another like it. A threshold. A ritual site mapped not in leagues or towns, but in alignments and stars. The same year, 1213, also marks a strange entry in the personal chronicle of Pope Innocent III. In a private letter to a cardinal, he references rumors of a rite among certain knights who mistake the horizon for a door. He does not name the Templars directly, but he does warn of those who travel in darkness and claim it light. This perception of the pilgrimage as heresy rather than devotion may be why it vanished from official Templar records. But its echoes are persistent. In the village of Braganza, an oral tradition survives of shadow knights who walk the mountain at midsummer and vanish before dawn. The tales speak not of fear, but of reverence, men who guard a sleeping light. Even more intriguing is the reappearance of the pilgrimage's motif in an illuminated manuscript from the 14th century produced in secrecy by surviving Templar affiliates in Portugal. The manuscript Liber Iterum depicts 10 black-robed figures walking west across an abstract landscape, their shadows falling not behind them, but ahead. The final page shows a gate of stars with a single line of text in illo anno redditus incipiet. In that year, the return shall begin. The implication is staggering, that the pilgrimage was not a journey toward forgiveness or enlightenment, but a movement designed to awaken or preserve something. That it was not an ending, but a setting of stones, a planting of signals. Perhaps even a synchronization. The number 1010 Knights also recurs in multiple Templar documents. In some traditions, 10 represents not completion, but the return to one, a loop, a cycle. In Kabbalistic symbolism, it marks the Sephirot, a structure that connects the divine to the earthly. In the spiral diagrams of the Tomar chamber, 10 points surround the center. Always 10, never 11. If the Black Pilgrimage was meant to activate or connect locations, a kind of temporal network built across the landscape, then these knights were not travelers. They were initiators, tracing patterns across Earth to mirror something in the heavens, leaving behind not relics, but reminders. You imagine them now cloaked, silent, riding west into a land where no welcome awaited them, carrying not weapons, but a ritual. Perhaps even a prophecy. One not spoken, not written, but walked into the ground itself. And now, centuries later, that line begins to glow again, drawn by a fire the world forgot. But that never went out. It's easy to imagine the Templars as a sealed system, monastic warriors bound to Christian kings, answerable only to Rome. But the truth, like sand beneath a fortress wall, slips sideways, especially in the east. In the deserts beyond Jerusalem, in the shadow of broken empires and forgotten cities, the Templars encountered more than enemies. They found echoes, mirrors, orders older than theirs, whispering similar vows under different names. And in some cases, they didn't fight them, they listened. The earliest hints of this come not from European records, but from Arabic texts. A Syrian chronicler named Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, writing in the 13th century, described foreign knights of Iron Cross meeting with members of the Batiniya sect near Aleppo. The Batinis, esoteric Shia, often conflated with the assassins, were deeply secretive guardians of layered truth keepers of hidden meanings beneath sacred text. According to Al-Khatib, the meeting occurred not on a battlefield, but at a dried riverbed under the stars. No arms were drawn. Instead, the knights sat in stillness as if all sound were forbidden. That silence would become a recurring theme. In 1251, a Templar scroll, known as the Tractatus de Umbra, made brief mention of the desert brethren described as keepers of the hour unspoken. The phrasing is odd, half scriptural, half mystical. It appears only once more in surviving documents carved onto the inner lid of a funerary box found in Petra, bearing the Templar cross overlaid with a crescent moon. Most scholars long assumed such exchanges were apocryphal or symbolic, born of Romantic Orientalism. But in 1986, an excavation team working near the ancient city of Hatra uncovered a hidden chamber filled with ossuaries bearing inscriptions in a mix of Syriac and Latin. Among them was a stone disc inscribed with an 8-pointed star, around the rim united in the third veil, until the third eclipse. The third eclipse. Again. This shared language, this strange syncretism hints at something more than espionage or accidental alliance. It suggests a convergence, a point where belief systems, despite their surface differences, recognized a common fire they each had chosen to guard, and possibly to delay. Among the most compelling pieces of evidence is a set of copper tablets found in 1909 in the ruins of Al-Ukhdud in present-day Saudi Arabia. One tablet depicts a ritual involving 13 participants, 10 veiled figures forming a circle, 3 standing apart, hands raised to a night sky etched with unfamiliar constellations. Beneath them, a caption in Nabatean script translates loosely to "the watchers of flame, who do not burn, who wait beneath sand and sword." When mirrored with Templar rituals found in the Liber Obscura, a manuscript suppressed by the Inquisition in 1457, a familiar structure emerges, a triadic division of roles, silent oaths, fire passed hand to hand. And then there's the dream. Multiple 13th century Templar confessions describe visions encountered during fasting rituals in the desert. The dreams vary in detail, but share recurring imagery. A black tower under a starless sky. A rider without eyes, a sun that flickers like a candle before vanishing altogether. The phrasing in one confession, "the eclipse within the blood," is nearly identical to a dream text preserved by the Nizari Ismailis, whose nocturnal rites speak of the inner eclipse that breaks the seals of fire. In 2014, Dr. Amal Zahiri published a comparative analysis of these Templar visions and similar Sufi texts from the same period. Her conclusion was controversial but precise. Both groups appear to have tapped into a common initiatory experience guided not by scripture, but by location, ritual, deprivation, and repetition. Not madness, not mysticism, transmission. And where did this lead? One potential answer lies in the form of a peculiar artifact now held in private custody, a silver talisman shaped like a tear found in the Negev desert by Bedouin shepherds in the 1930s. On one side a cross, on the other a line of Kufic script. The seal sleeps beneath the breath of the third wind. The metallurgic composition matches Templar reliquaries from Portugal, but the origin is distinctly Arab, a hybrid object impossible to explain in isolation, unless someone meant it to be both. A mark of allegiance across belief forged not in doctrine, but necessity. Because here's what neither side could admit publicly: that whatever the prophecy was, whatever secret the Templars feared, was not theirs alone. It did not come from Rome, nor Mecca, nor Jerusalem. It came from beneath stone, beneath myth, beneath time. And when both sides, Templar and Desert Brotherhood, recognized the same symbols in each other's rites, they didn't kill. They kneeled, together. The phrase "covenant of sand" appears in a single surviving Templar text from Antioch, paired with an odd epigraph: "When flame and crescent cross, silence must hold." The cross and crescent, symbols of conflict for centuries here, joined in mutual restraint. Not to destroy, but to guard. You realize now that the Desert Brotherhood wasn't a group. It was an understanding. An agreement whispered under starlight, never written, never preached, but passed between men whose eyes saw the same eclipse rising in their dreams. And the third eclipse, it's still ahead. The records are sparse, fragmented, but they repeat a name, a phrase really spoken in tones too cautious for accusation, too haunted for legend, the children of the crescent blade. First mentioned in a 1309 inquisitorial transcript from Carcassonne, the phrase appeared in the testimony of a Templar sergeant who, under pressure and exhaustion, claimed that some brothers follow the crescent more than the cross. When asked if he meant Islam, he shook his head and whispered, "Not the faith. The blade." The interrogators assumed he was delirious, but the phrase returns. In an untranslated footnote found in a Templar codex preserved in Cyprus, a marginal hand had added, "They are born to it, born with eyes that do not close. The blade bends toward them, but does not cut." Again, no context, no name, only symbol. So what or who were these children? A 14th century Spanish priest named Bernat de Girona wrote of a peculiar group of children born in a remote corner of the Kingdom of Aragon, children marked by a crescent-shaped scar on the inside of their wrists. He claimed they were descendants of a heretical sect, possibly Templar-linked, who believed that certain bloodlines were touched by prophecy, not through divine blessing, but through ancestral convergence. He called it the echoing line. He also noted with palpable discomfort that these children were often taken by hooded riders in the night, never to be seen in confession or communion again. At first glance, this reads like folklore, a medieval version of changeling stories perhaps. But then in 1891, during renovations of an old chapel near Montségur, a mason discovered a hidden reliquary embedded in the floor. Inside a small velvet pouch, a faded white ribbon, and an iron pendant shaped like a curved dagger with no hilt, just a blade. In the base of the dagger, carved with the precision of a jeweler, the Latin inscription, "Sanguis in silentio servandus est." Blood must be kept in silence. You begin to wonder, were these children literal or symbolic, perhaps both? A controversial 1995 study by Dr. Eva Morone analyzed genealogical patterns traced through surviving Templar family lines, those that intermarried, relocated, or vanished into monastic orders. She discovered anomalies in naming patterns, identical given names, repeated every 3 generations, strange clustering around certain lunar birth dates, and most curiously isolated mentions of guardianship. Claims attached to children with no paternal documentation. Several families were traced to Languedoc, to Sintra, and to a rural valley near Acre. The one thing they shared, an oral history of children, taken not by force, but by ritual. Inquisitorial documents lend reluctant weight. In 1310, during the infamous Paris trials, a monk recorded the following confession from a Templar initiate: "I was not meant to wear the white. I was born under the blade. They marked me as moonborn and swore me to the silence. My real name is not known to me." Again, you could dismiss this as trauma under duress until you compare it with a document found in the Vatican's suppressed archives, a scroll marked "Non Publicandum, not to be published." Dated 1308, it details the interrogation of a Templar chaplain who refused to speak, but who, according to the report, wore an amulet not of Christ, but of crescent steel with a red thread around the neck. When asked about it, he said only, "She waits." The she is never named, but an apocryphal poem found in a Sufi codex from 12th century Aleppo speaks of the girl who remembers before she is born, who carries the blade of the moon in her mouth and speaks only when the stars weep. The poem was believed to be allegorical. Now one wonders, could the children of the crescent blade be descendants of a pact? A bloodline carefully nurtured, hidden within both the Christian and Islamic worlds, meant not to rule, but to bear witness, were they trained to recognize something, an alignment, a signal, an unfolding, that might explain why they were taken, not to be silenced, but to be prepared. In 2007, a researcher discovered a forgotten chapel in western Portugal, untouched since the 1600s. Hidden behind a wall panel was a mural, faded but visible, of 10 children, standing in a circle, all bearing different cloaks, none with faces. Above them, a sword suspended in air. The blade was curved like a crescent moon. Along the edge, in careful script, "Born in silence, they awaken when the line breaks." The line. The bloodline. It's worth recalling that several earlier Templar codes, those tied to the black-mantled inner circle, refer to a blood that must not mix. That phrase once seemed racial. Now it seems chronological. Perhaps they weren't protecting bloodlines for purity. Perhaps they were keeping threads from crossing too early, preventing a convergence before the right moment. Which brings us back to the present. In 2023, a geneticist in Lisbon, working on an unrelated project, noticed something strange in mitochondrial DNA patterns, traced through a group of individuals with no known relation. All from distinct regions: France, Portugal, Syria. All carrying an unusual non-coding sequence that shouldn't match, a shape in the data. When she mapped it, the strands formed a spiral nearly identical to the glyph found in the heretic map. The report was never published. The lab was defunded. But the pattern was saved. If the children of the crescent blade still exist, they may not know it. They may be scattered, unknowing, carrying within them a cipher that has waited not just generations, but centuries. Not a symbol, not a map, but a memory. One that remembers when to wake. No document remains. No chant, no charter, no official rite ever preserved what happened across those 3 nights. And yet the echoes are there in whispers, in ritual bones, buried too far from consecrated ground, in dreams described the same way across centuries by men who never knew each other. The Oath of 3 Nights was never written down because it wasn't meant for parchment. It was meant for transformation. Most military orders had initiations. The Templars famously required vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. But scattered confessions from the trials reveal another process, one kept apart from the known initiation rite. A ritual held in darkness, often underground, over 3 consecutive nights. It was never called an initiation. Instead, the word most commonly used was transitus passage. You begin to stitch together the fragments. From the trial of Pierre de Montregard in 1311, they asked me not to speak my name. Not for the first night, not until the second veil was lifted. From the confession of Renaud de Saintré, I lay in the stone box until the stars returned. When they opened the lid, I was no longer myself. I was only part. From the testimony of an anonymous postulant in Toulouse, we buried him. Not in earth, in silence. He swore never to awaken the seal before the fire returns. That was the vow. It's difficult to know what was symbolic and what was literal. The stone box may have been metaphor, but maybe not. In 1998, a collapsed chamber beneath the ruined commandery at Avignon was found to contain 3 granite sarcophagi, sealed unmarked and empty. Around them, etched into the walls, a phrase in medieval Latin repeated over and over: Tres noxae unum lumen. 3 nights, 1 light. The pattern begins to emerge. Night 1, silence. The postulant lies alone in a sealed space coffin cave, crypt denied speech, food, and light. Not as punishment, but as ritual unmaking. Night 2, vision. According to Cathar-inspired texts linked to exiled Templars, the initiate is brought into a second chamber, a circular room with no icons, no altar, only flame. There he receives the mirror of ash, an object described in conflicting ways as a bowl, a glass, a pendant. It is never described visually, only emotionally. It shows what does not yet exist. Night 3, Vow. The final night involves binding a secret promise spoken only once and never repeated under something referred to as the listening star. A phrase with no known Christian reference, yet common in ancient Mesopotamian texts, where the listening star referred to Sirius, the brightest light in the sky, tied to rebirth and threshold. In 1431, a condemned monk in Venice claimed to have undergone the vow of the veiled flame, a phrase now believed to be a distortion of the oath. He wrote before his execution, "I saw him, the rider without sound. I know what must not return, and I have sealed my tongue." His final words were a fragment of a Templar chant, long thought lost under 3. The one burns. Under 1, the fire waits. More than metaphor. This was initiation into a different order altogether. A secret embedded within the Templars, like a vein of black stone inside white marble visible only in the right light. You recall now the reports of black-robed figures, the crescent blade children, the chamber in Tamar aligned to solstice fire. All threads in the same hidden weave, and it wasn't just the Templars. In a Sufi manuscript dated to 1184, a rite called Laylat al-Sir, the Night of the Secret, is described, in which initiates lie buried in sand, instructed to breathe shallow and forget their name until the third moonrise. The final line of the text reads, "Then speak the truth that cannot be said. Say it in silence." The overlap is unnerving. It implies not imitation, but convergence, that across faiths, across centuries, there were those who understood a deeper rhythm, something that needed guarding, not with violence, but with silence. A secret that could not be spoken because language itself would distort it. Something only ritual could preserve. Something the mind must remember without ever fully knowing. In 2006, a cave system was discovered beneath the Scottish Highlands near a ruined Templar preceptory. Deep within, archaeologists found 3 hollowed-out chambers, aligned in a triangle. In the center chamber, a pedestal cracked and empty. On the walls, 13 notches carved with mathematical precision. One theory holds that each notch corresponds to a century since the oath was last performed. If true, the final notch ends in 2027. Again that date. The repetition grows heavier. Spirals, veils. 3. Silence. Flame. Return. Some now believe the Oath of 3 Nights was never a rite of passage, but a ritual encryption, a way to encode knowledge into human beings without ever letting it touch paper. That each participant became a vault, a living archive, their body storing something beyond words, activated only when certain stars returned to position. Not a cult, not a rebellion, a mechanism. You try to imagine the moment buried beneath stone, breath tight in the lungs, the flame trembling in the distance, and the sense not of fear, but of being watched by time itself. Not judged, not cursed, chosen. And with that choice, a single thought passed across lips that would never speak again. We are not the end. We are the lock. It was never marked on any map. Not in Crusader charts, not in Ottoman records, not even in the local folk tales that clung to the coasts like salt mist. For centuries it lay half swallowed by the Cypriot hills, hidden beneath cypress trees and superstition. Locals avoided the place instinctively. They spoke of strange echoes, birds that wouldn't land nearby, and animals that wandered too close only to flee yelping into the dark. It wasn't until 1924 that a British surveyor charting post-war development zones near Limassol stumbled on what appeared to be the partial ruins of an old garrison. But it wasn't Crusader military architecture. It was older, stranger. The walls, though worn by time, followed no defensive logic, no battlements, no lookouts, Instead, they formed a perfect octagon, each side precisely 15 feet long. The angles too clean, the stone too smooth. At the center, a single entrance, sunken and unadorned, leading down. What they'd found was not a fortress. It was a chamber, a sanctuary, and eventually something more unsettling. Inside, the walls bore no iconography, no crosses, no saints, no names, only symbols etched so finely into the dark limestone that they could only be seen under low-light spirals, stars, and a recurring shape scholars would later call the fracture glyph, resembling an eye split down the center. Most unnerving was the light itself. The chamber absorbed brightness like sand swallowing rain. Torches flickered unnaturally. Candles dimmed. Photographs turned out grainy and gray, as though the air itself refused to hold an image. A small inscription carved in a dead dialect of Greek ran around the inner circle of the ceiling. Translated roughly, it read, "Hear the stars speak. Here the silence burns." When word reached a Templar historian at the University of Edinburgh, he recognized the description. It matched a passage in a little-known 14th-century Templar codex titled Ritus Occultus, a book banned and nearly lost during the Inquisition. In it, a final chapter describes a mirror chamber beneath the Isle of Copper where light does not pass, but speaks. For centuries, scholars assumed it was allegory. After the discovery, they weren't so sure. The Temple of Black Light, as it came to be known, didn't fit into any known Christian architectural tradition. But its design mirrored ancient Mesopotamian star temples, especially those associated with the Chaldean priesthood, a group known for tracking eclipses, transits, and precessional shifts in the night sky. And here's the problem. No known connection exists between the Chaldeans and the Templars, unless you believe they were looking for something older than the church. Excavations revealed an odd feature. In the middle of the chamber, beneath a collapsed stone plinth, lay a basin of smooth obsidian. No drainage, no carvings, just a reflective surface polished to a black mirror. Around its edge were 12 small indentations, each once holding what researchers believe were stones or gems now missing. But more than that, beneath the basin, buried in sediment, was a thin silver plate. On it, a diagram. A perfect match to the central spiral on the heretic map. The lines weren't decorative, they were instructions. And when overlaid on a map of the Eastern Mediterranean, the endpoints of the spiral matched locations of other anomalous sites. Tamar, Roslin, Montsegur, Petra, a network, a pulse. Each spoke in the wheel, pointing back to Cyprus, back to this chamber where the light did not illuminate but measured. Why Cyprus? A small clue comes from the 13th century travel log of Odo de Saint-Amand, a Templar knight who wrote of a place where the stars do not move as they should, and where the air carries the weight of years. He describes a pilgrimage undertaken by 12 knights unarmed, who entered a valley under a moonless sky and emerged 3 days later speaking only in riddles. One of them, it is said, left the order and walked into the mountains alone. His only words, "The eye saw me back." The recurring theme in all references to the Temple of Black Light is dislocation. Time slips, visual distortions. One modern researcher who spent a night alone in the chamber reported feeling as if the walls were breathing. Another claimed that shadows moved in ways inconsistent with any light source. Most notably, he described hearing a sound, not music, not words, just a low thrum like a heartbeat inside stone. Some now argue the chamber was not a temple in the religious sense, but a device, a kind of lens. Not for looking outward, but for aligning inward, matching human perception with cosmic rhythm. A ritual amplifier. And this would explain why the Templars might have sealed it, If the Oath of Three Knights was a method of encoding memory and the heretic map a system for tracking time, then the Temple of Black Light was perhaps the moment of calibration, where mind, body, and sky were brought into convergence, not to awaken a god, but to awaken a memory seeded across generations. One last detail often omitted from official reports. The chamber's walls, when scanned with modern equipment, revealed a hidden layer of markings etched with a mineral compound that glows faintly in infrared. The lines form a pattern when seen from above, a serpent eating its tail surrounding the eight-pointed star. And in the center, an almost imperceptible script, 2027. You can dismiss it all as coincidence, or imagination, or the trick of centuries echoing back on themselves. But if the Templars really did carry a prophecy, not a belief but a blueprint, then this chamber was the moment it took shape. The place where silence spoke, and the fire behind the stars finally looked back. It doesn't draw crowds, not like the cathedrals, not even like the ruins. But if you drive through the rolling lowlands near Midlothian and turn just before the road to Roslyn Glen, you'll find it small, stone-bound, hunched beneath the weight of ivy and time. Roslyn Chapel gets the attention with its impossible carvings and rumored scrolls. But just beyond the tree line sits a far older structure nameless on most maps, referred to in only a handful of parish documents as Capella Tacita, the Silent Chapel. It was never consecrated, that much is clear. No record of mass ever held there, no resident priest, no burial rites issued. And yet the architecture is exact. Gothic ribs, apse facing east, a nave only large enough for 10. 10 again. Always 10. The story goes that in 1447, William Sinclair, the founder of Roslyn Chapel, oversaw modifications to the smaller chapel nearby, but not for religious purposes. A surviving account from a stonemason's journal notes the addition of star vaulting without symbol, without word, and refers to the structure as the listening house. He records being forbidden to speak while working there, not for decorum, but by command. When researchers began to study the site in the late 20th century, they noticed something strange. The chapel seemed built not for congregation, but for alignment. The north and south walls are precisely spaced to channel sunlight through a slit window only during one moment each year, the summer solstice. At sunrise, the beam hits the rear wall and illuminates a stone panel carved with 9 concentric circles. Within them, spiral patterns that match those found in the Temple of Black Light. More than coincidence. The same hand, if not literally, then ritually. And behind that panel in 1984, a cavity was discovered. Within it, a single object, not a relic, a mechanism. It resembled a kind of astrolabe, but vertical, forged of brass and wood, with delicate arms that rotated along spiral grooves. Each spiral ended in a fixed point, not labeled with stars, but with glyphs. The same glyphs that appear in the heretic map. And beneath the device, a phrase etched in Latin, tacebit lux donec iter recludatur. The light shall be silent until the path is reopened. No record exists of how the mechanism was used, but one theory published in a limited academic journal proposed that it functioned as a resonance tracker, measuring not time, but harmonic frequency. That theory might have been dismissed as fantasy, were it not for what was found directly below the chapel. In 1992, ground scans revealed a circular substructure beneath the foundation 12 feet below, with walls thicker than the chapel itself. Accessed through a collapsed stairwell, the chamber was lined with quartz stone and sealed tight. No door, no window, just a single indentation in the center of the floor shaped to hold the mechanism above. And in the center, a black stone. Polished to a mirror's surface, the stone seemed to absorb light, just like the obsidian basin in Cyprus. When struck accidentally at first, it resonated. Not a chime, a hum, subaudible, deep, measured. When aligned with the mechanism above and the solstice light, the vibration increased, forming interference patterns along the floor. Geometric, spiral. The researchers left it unexplained. The church said nothing. But the resonance was recorded. It lasted exactly 12 minutes and 27 seconds. That number matches to the second the rotation period of a known pulsar in the Vela constellation, a star referenced in Mesopotamian texts as the Whispering One. Coincidence, possibly. Or maybe not. Because if the chapel was built not to glorify faith, but to detect something, some alignment, some vibration, some moment, then it wasn't a church. It was a sensor, a ritual instrument disguised as a place of worship, one designed to activate not continuously, but at precise intervals marked by stars and stones, aided by a machine passed from hand to hidden hand. Perhaps that's why it was left unmarked, to keep it safe, to keep it dormant. One more thread, a letter from 1491 written by a Sinclair descendant to a Templar remnant in Portugal, preserved in a Jesuit archive. It reads, "The sound returned this year. The seal did not break, but it groaned. We await your answer. The spiral grows warm. That letter is real. The ink is dated. The tone not dramatic, not mystical. Clinical, afraid." If the chapel was one of many stations in a larger network, points of resonance built along invisible lines, then the prophecy wasn't just spoken. It was tuned, like a chord waiting to be struck. And when it rings true, when the note aligns, something responds. Not God, not devil, just the next phase. It is said that when the fires began in France, when the arrests swept through the Templar commanderies like an unexpected plague, some brothers stood firm, some confessed, and some simply disappeared. But a few didn't vanish into monasteries or foreign courts. They vanished over water. Not into the chaos of flight, but into purpose. Because some ships were already waiting, already loaded, already charted for a direction no papal envoy would think to follow. Not east, not to Rome, not even to the safety of England or the Highlands. West. In 1307, the port of La Rochelle, then under Templar control, recorded the sudden, unscheduled departure of several vessels in the days following the mass arrests ordered by Philip IV. No destinations were listed. No cargo was registered. Witnesses described heavily armed men loading sealed crates, private chests, and bundles wrapped not in merchant cloth, but in priestly linen. And then, silence. The ships never returned. No wrecks were found. No survivors. But over time, stories drifted back on the tides. Stories that those ships hadn't sunk and they hadn't been lost. They had made landfall, just not where anyone expected. Theories abound. Some claim they sailed to Scotland, joining Sinclair allies and fading into the northern mists. Others whisper of secret colonies in the Azores or Madeira before those islands were even officially discovered. But one account, buried in the private papers of a Portuguese navigator named Duarte de Alvim, suggests something far bolder. A voyage across the ocean toward what we now call the Americas. In his 1434 diary, de Alvim references an old map given to him by a man who bore no nation, only a ring with the cross of silence. The map depicted a landmass beyond the Pillars of Hercules, a land called Terra Rubra, the Red Land. The color isn't random. It appears again in a scroll fragment uncovered at Tamar, referring to the western flame beyond the blood-colored earth, and again in the ciphered calendar, a point marked R, not for Rome, but for Ruber, with the date 1314 beneath it. The same year de Molay burned. The same year the last ship was said to have sailed. But why go west? What would they have carried that far beyond the reach of kings or inquisitors? The answer may lie in a recurring term that emerges in scattered documents from Templar survivors, translatio arcanum, the transferring of the secret. This wasn't exile. It was continuity. Not escape, but delivery. The implication is clear. The prophecy, the black seal, the spiral, the flame wasn't just meant to be hidden. It was meant to be moved, to lie dormant not in fortress walls or monastery cells, but in distance, in obscurity. And where better to hide something that must one day return than in a land the church hadn't named, the maps hadn't inked, and the kings hadn't claimed. In 1972, a stone was unearthed in Nova Scotia bearing a worn inscription, a circle surrounding a cross flanked by two dots. Though faded, the carving style matched that of 14th-century Templar gravestones found in Portugal. Skeptics called it a hoax. Yet in 2010, a matching symbol was discovered on a lead disc buried beneath the ruins of a collapsed chapel in the Scottish borders, alongside a pendant made of red jasper. The same red, the same spiral pattern, the same silent suggestion, a thread pulled westward. And then there is the confession of Jacques Daumont, a Templar commander arrested but never tried. In his final letter, smuggled from a prison cell and preserved in the archives of Carcassonne, he writes, "They will not find the flame. It is carried. Its shape sleeps in red stone, and it will wake when the air itself opens." Scholars dismiss this as metaphor madness. But the phrase shape sleeps in red stone echoes again in a Native American oral tradition recorded by Jesuit missionaries in the 1600s. Among the Mi'kmaq of eastern Canada, one elder spoke of white men who came not with guns, but with stars and fire. They said they guarded a sleeping stone, and when it opens, the sky will speak again. It's easy to be skeptical, easy to mark all of this down to coincidence or romantic invention. But when red jasper beads carved with spiral notches were recovered from a burial mound near the coast of Maine, and when carbon dating placed them around 1350, it became harder to explain away. The voyage wasn't a desperate flight. It was a continuation of the ritual line. The flame wasn't extinguished in France. It was carried forward across sea and silence to where no pope could see, no king could reach. And the prophecy they protected didn't end at a pyre. It landed, and it waits. It was never meant to be read aloud. Not in a church, not in a court, not even in the safety of a Templar chapter house. The scroll of the bound names was not a ledger or a testament, it was a lock, a sealing document, a final act of defiance woven into parchment soaked in oil and hidden under silence so dense that even those who found it centuries later refused to touch it barehanded. The scroll surfaced briefly like a dream remembered only during sleep in 1683 when a fire in a private archive in northern Portugal exposed a hidden chamber beneath a chapel floor. The contents, a scorched casket lined with lead sealed in wax containing a single scroll wrapped in red silk coiled tighter than a serpent in winter. The monks who opened it reportedly stopped breathing as they unrolled it, not out of fear, but reverence. The scroll didn't record deeds or land or titles. It listed names, hundreds of them. Names of men, women, children. Most unfamiliar, but some terrifyingly recognizable. Among them, Jacques de Molay, Raymond of Arles, Hugh de Payens. But not as authors, as entries. Each name was written beside a symbol, some simple, some impossibly complex. And next to every third name, a word non-convenient they must not meet. The implication was staggering. This wasn't a family tree. It was a map of separation. a chart of avoidance, a record of people who were never supposed to be in the same room, the same time, the same bloodline. But why some believe the scroll was a genealogical prophecy. Others argue it was a safeguard, a list of convergences that could not be allowed lest something activate. The scroll's final column bore dates not of birth or death, but of Lyman thresholds. Each date corresponded with celestial alignments, eclipses, planetary conjunctions, solstice crossings. And beside the last entry, written in a different hand, a date that hadn't yet come, 2106 35, later called the final threshold. This matched a line in the ciphered calendar beneath Tomar last rotation, binds the 12th veil. Flame shall judge. Somewhere between warning and countdown, the scroll reveals a horrifying possibility that the Templars were not just guardians of a relic or a secret, but of a genetic signal. That certain people through blood memory or ritual imprint carried something. Not a disease, not a blessing, but a code. One that if ever united in the wrong pattern, would do what prophecy always implies. Begin again. One scholar, Mario Cardoso, gained access to partial transcriptions of the scroll in the early 20th century. He published his findings under a pseudonym in a banned esoteric journal, claiming that the names are not literal. They are echoes, lineage signatures, fractal identities repeated across centuries. He believed that the scroll tracked not individuals, but archetypes, specific arrangements of temperament, thought pattern, and symbolic alignment. When those traits converged too closely, geographically, genetically, ritually, something opened. Not metaphorically, he never explained what. Cardoso died in an asylum, having etched a spiral of repeating names into his cell wall 17 layers deep. The final name, Custos Incognitus, the unknown guardian. And yet parallels continue to surface. A Jesuit missionary in the Yucatan recorded a Mayan story of the sealed fire, which must never know its name again. In Kabbalistic traditions, there is a concept called the echo soul, an identity that recurs across generations in different vessels. Even certain Sufi mystics speak of those who must not gather lest the mirror become door. So the scroll wasn't isolationist for moral reasons. It wasn't about power or purity. It was strategic. And the fact that it ended in 2035 suggests two things. First, that the prophecy's endpoint was never about a single apocalypse. It was about convergence, a slow gathering of echoes carried through bloodlines, through ritual, through silence, until the final configuration completed the sequence. Second, that those entrusted with the scroll knew it might one day be found, not by the church, not by kings, but by one of the bound. And what then do they remember? One unsettling footnote remains: the scroll contained a second layer of names, faint, written in smaller hand, as if added later. These were different, fewer. But beside each was a glyph seen only once before on the obsidian basin in the Temple of Black Light. Each of these names had no accompanying threshold date, only a phrase, if broken, reunite before the solstice, not to prevent, but to complete. You stare at that phrase and realize something dark. Perhaps they weren't preventing a prophecy. Perhaps they were delaying an arrival. And the scroll wasn't a warning. It was an invitation. Time to open when the right voices remembered the right silence, when the flame behind the stars burned just bright enough to cast its first shadow back onto Earth. History remembers them as mistakes, brief schisms, political flare-ups, inconvenient footnotes. The anti-popes, men who claimed the throne of St. Peter without the blessing of the Church, elected in defiance or desperation, forgotten as soon as unity returned. But one of them, it seems, was never meant to rule. He was meant to guard something. Pedro of Luna, better known by his papal name Benedict XIII, held court not in Rome, but in Avignon, then in the lonely fortress at Peñíscola, clinging to relevance as the Church tried to erase him. They called him stubborn, deluded. They said he refused to accept reality, but perhaps he understood it too well. In 1411, a letter now preserved in the secret Vatican archives records an intercepted correspondence between Benedict XIII and a group of unnamed knightly guardians. The letter is encoded and was initially dismissed as apocalyptic rambling, but its decrypted version speaks of a fire buried under the Black Oath and a silence that must not break until the second veil is lifted in the land of red stone. The phrases match language used in the heretic map, the ciphered calendar, and the Tomar chamber. Whoever wrote to Benedict and whoever received his reply was fluent in the language of the Black Prophecy. It was not the only contact. A year later, a Dominican friar named Antonio de Cervo, acting as an inquisitor in Aragon, reported that Benedict had harbored excommunicated knights in his coastal stronghold. The men were never named, never brought to trial. But the friar's letter makes one specific accusation: that Benedict presided over a rite in which the sealed book was neither opened nor destroyed, but placed again within the Ark of Time. What he meant by Ark of Time remains unclear, but the phrase appears again centuries later in a Templar-inspired esoteric manual describing the return cycle of the bound flame. Why would an anti-pope already politically fragile entangle himself with heretical knights and coded rites? Unless he knew something the legitimate church had chosen to forget. Benedict XIII was no fool. Before his papal claim, he was a canon lawyer, a scholar. He knew the dangers of association with condemned orders. And yet he allowed them sanctuary. More than that, he offered them cover. Witnesses in the region described groups of armored men moving in and out of Peñíscola under nightfall carrying objects wrapped in cloth, always escorted by monks. One record found in the town's civic archive lists an unusual expenditure: iron hinges, obsidian tiles, and wax without scent. No use for any of that, unless you're sealing something that must not be sensed. Modern researchers examining the lower levels of Peñíscola Castle have found evidence of a blocked corridor beneath the old papal apartments walled off in the 15th century. Ground-penetrating radar reveals a sealed chamber approximately 12 feet across. Access has been denied, citing historical preservation, but documents suggest the chamber was constructed quickly and secretly during Benedict's final years, a private act of guardianship or entombment. One document, unsigned, unsealed, found hidden inside a hollow beam of the castle chapel, makes an even bolder claim. He made the pact not with Rome, but with silence, to delay, not deny, until the serpent speaks in stone. Again the serpent, again the stone. Symbols that have followed the prophecy from the Temple Mount to Tamar, to the coast of Nova Scotia. It is possible that Benedict XIII's stubborn refusal to relinquish his title was not vanity, but necessity. As long as he held papal status, however disputed, he had the authority to protect what no one else could. And when his political power collapsed, so did the open passageways. The silence was sealed again, but the language lingers. A 17th-century Jesuit mystic, Father Juan de Olivares, who studied Benedict's writings, extensively claimed that the antipope left behind a book never published, titled Liber Nocturnus, the Book of Night. Its location remains unknown, but a fragment from Olivares's notes contains a line attributed to Benedict himself: "The true fire does not cleanse. It returns. And when it speaks again, even Rome will kneel." If true, the bargain was this: allow the prophecy to persist in shadow. Delay its fulfillment. Maintain the exile not just of men, but of meaning. The Templars had the scroll, the maps, the seals, Benedict had legitimacy enough to bury what couldn't yet rise. And so the prophecy didn't die. It hibernated, waiting for the veils to lift the names, to align the silence, to vibrate just enough to fracture. One pope turned his back. Another, illegitimate, unacknowledged, held the door shut just a little longer. He wasn't crowned with glory. But maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe his crown was the lock. It sounds like eugenics, or superstition, or one of the many shadowed fears that have haunted human history, of bloodlines, of chosen lineages, of forbidden unions. But when the Templars wrote of the blood that must not mix, they were not speaking in moral terms. They were writing instructions, not rules, contingency plans. The phrase appears sparingly in the trial records, most often buried in indirect testimony. One knight under torture in Paris claimed he had slept beneath the circle of names, and that during his initiation, he was warned never to bind with the flameborn. Another, from a Portuguese confession, stated cryptically, "We were told never to seed the red thread with the white." Most dismissed these phrases as madness or misremembered heresy. But in 1899, a private manuscript known as De Sanguine Separando, on the separation of blood, was recovered from a collapsed granary near Braga, written in Latin dated to 1321 and attributed to an unnamed Templar chaplain. The text details an internal classification system used by an unnamed Templar faction, not ranks, not titles, but bloodlines. The manuscript outlines two threads, the linea ignis and the linea umbra, the line of fire and the line of shadow. According to the text, these lines were not genealogical in the normal sense. They were patterns of resonance carried not in names, but in the echo of thought and dream. When these lines converged, when the fire and the shadow met in the same blood, something changed. Something opened. The document doesn't say what. Only that such a convergence must not occur before iter unum, the one journey, is complete. What that journey refers to is unclear. But one hypothesis comes from a rare annotated version of the heretic map found in a Jesuit archive in Marseille. Alongside the spiral notations and eclipse markers is a set of symbols matching those in De Sanguine Separando, specifically where the lines intersect. Each intersection is marked by a year, the final year 2033, 2 years before the scroll of bound names ends. The convergence window, the moment when the last unmixed guardians pass into the age of alignment. This suggests the Templars weren't guarding an object. They were guarding a sequence, a pattern of individuals who, if ever brought together in the wrong way at the wrong time, would complete a circuit. Not spiritual, not magical, rhythmic, encoded. In 2003, a controversial study examined mitochondrial DNA patterns in remote populations in southern France, western Portugal, and parts of Lebanon. The results were inconclusive until a private researcher noticed a particular motif in non-coding sequences shared across all 3 regions. He named it the red line complex. The sequence didn't correspond to disease or ancestry, or even physical traits, but it echoed a pattern first noted in astronomical alignment tables created by the Assyrians. Patterns inside patterns, timing inside genetics. This lines up with the strange birth registries from the Languedoc region in the 14th century. Records preserved by Cathar-descended communities noted moonborn children, those conceived or born under eclipses, often registered without paternal names. Some were quietly adopted by monastic orders. Some disappeared altogether. Those who remained often became wandering priests, scribes, or solitary hermits. All were instructed via local oral tradition to never marry outside the veiled. The veiled. The term repeats in the ciphered scrolls from Tamar, in the fragment attributed to Jacques de Molay, In the initiation chants recorded in the Templar fragments found beneath the Scottish chapel. So what were they guarding against? It may not have been catastrophe, at least not in the fire and brimstone sense. One possibility is transformation, a genetic, psychological, or spiritual unlocking, a kind of forced awakening across individuals whose minds had been encoded for centuries to remain dormant. If the bloodlines mixed, the result would not be destruction. It would be memory, a mass remembering of a thing no one alive was supposed to know. The Vatican, for its part, has remained conspicuously silent. But a leaked letter from the 1970s written by a Jesuit cardinal to an unnamed monastic order contains this line: "The strands are converging. Intervene if necessary. Keep the pattern intact until the final cross." Again, no explanation. But taken alongside the architectural resonance in places like Tamar and Rosslyn, the spiral codes in the heretic map, and the scroll of bound names, a haunting possibility emerges that the Templars weren't just guarding relics or ruins, but people, carriers, individuals meant to live separate lives in separate places for a reason, and that the greatest danger wasn't their knowledge, it was their union. You imagine it now, a man and woman meeting by chance, falling in love, bearing a child, unaware they each carried part of an ancient lock, and the child not a prophecy, a key. The blood that must not mix wasn't about prejudice, it was about timing, and time is almost up. 3 visions, 3 signs, 3 stories scattered across centuries and continents, yet eerily similar in structure and tone. The Templars referred to them not as prophecies, but as echoes of flame visions passed not through scripture, but through experience. They were not written in sacred texts or preached from pulpits, but described in low voices late at night to those considered ready. Each vision begins with a rising sign in the heavens. Each ends with an event, a fracture, a false awakening, and a flood. They are known collectively as the prophetic triad. The first vision, recorded in the Codex Tenebris, an apocryphal Templar volume found in a hollowed column beneath the collapsed chapel in Béziers, describes a night when the stars bent like candles in wind, and a great sign like a wound of fire appeared over a black tower. The witness, anonymous, writes of feeling as though he stood outside the world, hearing it breathe from below. He ends his vision with a line later etched into the inner wall of Rosslyn Chapel. The flame looked back. The second vision comes from a much stranger source, a 15th century Ottoman report written by a Sufi mystic named Nizam al-Haq. He recounts sheltering a group of foreign knights fleeing Cyprus during the early days of Mamluk expansion. One of the knights, aged and half-mad, told of a dream that had returned to him every solstice since his youth. In it, a man rises from the earth, not resurrected, but remembered only to find the world bent in mirror. The sky turns gold, then red, then silent. And all who look upon him believe they have been saved, until the ground opens beneath their feet. He wears the mask of light, the old knight whispered, but speaks in hunger. The third vision is the most detailed and the most terrifying. Found encoded in the spiral scrolls recovered from Tamar, it is attributed to a Templar scribe named Elias de Noir. His account was not a dream, but a waking trance brought on during a vigil in the Temple of Black Light. He wrote of standing before a drowned city, not metaphorically drowned, but literally submerged with lights still glowing faintly beneath the waves. A voice not heard, but felt told him this was once a gate, but you closed it too early. Now it opens too late. In the vision, 3 signs precede the drowning. First, a false star appears in the sky, blinking in and out like a signal. Second, an old tongue is spoken fluently by a child who has never heard it. and third, an eclipse that casts no shadow. The connections are tenuous until you place them on the spiral of the heretic map. Each aligns with one of the map's outer points. Each matches a cycle recorded in the ciphered calendar. And all three echo phrases found in the scroll of the bound names, the flame looks back. The mask of light. The gate that drowned. Some researchers believe the visions were not individual predictions, but phases of a single event unfolding across time felt by different carriers. That they were ritual impressions shared between those who had undergone the Oath of Three Knights, each passed forward through the resonance encoded in their silence. Others believe the visions are metaphorical, reflecting psychological trauma hallucinations born of fasting and solitude. But if that were true, why do they echo across cultures? Why does the language appear nearly identical in Latin Arabic and even Old Occitan? Why do the same three motifs recur: flame, mirror, and flood? One answer may come from a strange stone found in 2004 beneath the cathedral ruins of Saintes in southwestern France. The stone bore a carving of three intertwined figures, one winged, one crowned, one faceless. Around them spirals a drowned city and a phrase in Latin: nolite te decipi, quod venit, venit in tribus. Be not deceived. What comes, comes in threes. The stone was broken, as if struck deliberately. You begin to wonder, what if the prophetic triad is not a warning? What if it is a countdown? The first echo, the flame looks back, could represent the awakening of memory. The second, the mask of light, might be the return of false hope, cloaked in spiritual charisma. And the third, the drowned city, could be the collapse of something far older than any civilization. Not a city, but a covenant. A veil. A gate between phases of history. If the Templars received these visions or inherited them, their role was never simply to interpret. It was to delay, to fracture the convergence points, to scatter the signs. But the problem with signs is that eventually they return. And as the stars begin to match the old patterns and the spirals begin to close, the visions no longer feel distant. They feel rhythmic, inevitable. The flame looks back. The mask of light returns. The flood dreams beneath us. Three signs, three phases, one convergence. And the last echo, the Templars said, would not be spoken. It would be lived. His name appears where it shouldn't. In documents separated by centuries, continents, and languages, the ink changes, the style shifts, but the name remains. Not always exact, but close enough to raise eyebrows. Raymond d'Aubigné, R. de Aubigny, Raimundus Albinatus. Sometimes a knight, sometimes a scribe. Occasionally disturbingly unnamed, only described the man with the silver eyes. Most historians write it off as repetition, a common name, a mythos stitched to a type. After all, the Templars weren't known for longevity. Most died in battle at sea or on pyres. But in this case, something doesn't quite add up. The first confirmed appearance of Raymond is in 1212, listed as a preceptor at the Templar commandery near Toulouse. He's described as a quiet man, fluent in multiple tongues, rarely speaking in public. He signs a charter, then vanishes. 54 years later, his name appears again, this time in a tax ledger in Portugal, signed by a knight offering tribute in coin and silence to the Order of Christ. Same name, same handwriting. A note beside the entry reads, "He has not aged, still a coincidence." In 1378, amid the chaos of the Great Schism, a monk at Montserrat recorded a strange visitor. He wore outdated armor and refused all food. He stayed one night offering only a single phrase when asked for his name, "I am the lock." The monk, unsure whether he was mad or holy, recorded only a description. White hair unbent, silver in the eyes. The exact phrasing resurfaces 2 centuries later in a letter from a Franciscan missionary in New Spain who claimed to have met a white-robed man with silver eyes who spoke of stars beneath the sea. You start to see a pattern. In 1692, the archives of a small Scottish priory were nearly destroyed by fire. In the cleanup, a letter was found, tucked behind a cracked stone in the cellar. It was addressed to the next bearer of the line, written in archaic Latin, the author Raimundus A. The letter warned of the final tightening of the spiral, the red moon that carries the false return, and an awakening beneath mirrored stone. And then the line, "I have walked 3 empires. The 4th is nearly here, but the breath remains mine." So what is he? A myth, a symbol? Some say the Templars believed certain men could be made into vessels, living vaults for memory knowledge, perhaps even consciousness passed through ritual. The oath of 3 knights, if taken under precise alignment, might not just encode information, it might alter time's hold on the bearer. Not immortality, but dislocation, an unmooring. A way to live across ages, not linearly, but in loops. This would explain the strange phenomenon of Raimund's reappearances, always coinciding with convergence events, the Black Pilgrimage, the sealing of the scroll in Tamar, the partial activation of the Temple of Black Light in the 1800s. He is never the center, always the watcher, the hand that steadies, never signs, and if true, then he's not alone. The scroll of bound names lists 13 with no threshold date. They are marked with a glyph, 2 parallel lines crossed by a single diagonal stroke. That same symbol appears on the bottom of Raimund's alleged seal, found in a collapsed French monastery, and dated bizarrely to 3 different centuries based on the stratification layers in which parts of it were found. No explanation has ever satisfied both archaeologists and archivists. Some scholars believe Raimund is a composite, many men adopting the same name, the same role to create the illusion of continuity. But that theory frays quickly. The handwriting matches across generations. The voice, when quoted, uses identical phrasing. Most hauntingly, the messages never contradict each other. They build. In a 20th century journal by an esoteric researcher named Gaspard Villon, there is a record of a meeting with an anonymous figure on a remote Scottish cliffside in 1937. The man said little but handed Villon a folded card. On it, a spiral inked in red with the number 21.006 by 27 written in the center. Beneath it, in English, it begins again, and I remain. The idea that one man could carry the resonance of 1,000 years seems absurd. But if the Templars found something beneath Jerusalem, something that rewrote not just theology but time, then perhaps one oath-bound soul was required to bear its weight. Not a prophet, not a hero, a hinge. And if that's true, then somewhere out there, the man with silver eyes is still watching, still listening, still waiting for the pattern to complete. And when it does, when the spiral tightens and the stars fall back into place, he will speak again. Not with revelation, but with the voice of history finally allowed to finish its sentence. It wasn't supposed to happen. The prophecy in all its fragmented forms warned not just of what would come, but of what must be kept sealed until the signs aligned. And yet, once it wasn't. Once someone opened the lock too early, and the cost was almost everything. The record is obscure, buried in a footnote inside the personal correspondence of a 17th century Spanish abbot named Luis de Talavera. Writing from a Benedictine monastery in the mountains of Navarre, he mentions a season of waking terrors that began in 1641 after a sealed chamber beneath their scriptorium was disturbed during renovations. The entry is brief, hesitant, and ends with a chilling line. They broke the seal and it came through the mirrors. What followed was a wave of silence. Archives from the same monastery for the next 4 years are missing entirely, an anomaly given the otherwise meticulous records. Yet nearby parishes mention a strange series of events: a sudden illness with no symptoms, monks who wandered away in trance-like states, and nights filled with strange lights and a humming like deep wind behind stone. A visiting Jesuit priest described it as a sickness of memory, as if the past had forgotten its place. Then came the burial. Not of people, but of rooms. The entire scriptorium was filled with stone and plaster sealed off as if it never existed. The architectural plans were redrawn, the outer corridor repainted, and in 1651 the abbot himself disappeared, his final note reading simply, "I could no longer keep the rhythm out." Centuries later, during the Spanish Civil War, a rebel commander took shelter in the abandoned monastery. His personal diary, later recovered, mentions a deep unease in the southern wing and a bricked wall that radiated cold. He heard singing one voice, female, in a language he didn't know, but which made him cry. He never went back. So what was inside? In 1974, a group of rogue archaeologists operating under the guise of restoration attempted to reopen the buried chamber. They broke through 2 false walls before finding a spiral staircase that descended into nothingness. No air, no light, just dry silence. At the base, they discovered a stone basin surrounded by iron candelabras. In the center, a broken seal plate marked with the glyph of the Black Templars, and beneath that, fragments of parchment soaked in what appeared to be salt. Only one fragment was readable. It bore a date, August 18th, 1347, and the phrase, "The carrier failed." The gate gasped. "We contained what we could." Why 1347? The same year the Black Death began its sweep through Europe. Coincidence, perhaps. But the prophecy makes vague mention of a shadow wind released too early, one that taught man to fear breath and touch. The resemblance is unnerving. Some esoteric historians have gone so far as to suggest the plague itself was not the work of God or pestilence, but the unintended ripple of a seal breaking a memory, trying to re-enter the world too soon. This idea reappears in a lost letter attributed to Raymond d'Aubigné, addressed to the veiled scribes. In it, he warns that the pattern had been distorted once and must not be again. He writes, "The rhythm advanced before its echo. The mirror cracked from the wrong side. And later, we resealed it in breath, not stone. But the memory lingers in the walls. Do not dig where silence clings." Which leads to the chilling implication that the prophecy isn't merely about a future event, but about the recontainment of something already begun. Something tried to enter the world once was stopped, but not erased. Contained. Paused. And the Templars. They didn't just prevent its completion. They buried the memory of the breach, scattered the signs, encoded the warnings in architecture, song, and blood. The silent chapel, the ciphered map, the scroll of names, all parts of a second lock, a fail-safe for a world that had already seen what shouldn't be seen. Even the ciphered calendar found in the Black Templar site speaks of a fracture, 3 dates marked in black and 1 in red. The black marks are retroactive. 1347, 1641, 1914. The red mark is future 2027. Perhaps those were the moments the rhythm slipped through, or was about to, or almost did. In a recently declassified Vatican note dated 1953, a cardinal writes, "We now understand the first breach. It wasn't evil, it was echo, memory reasserting its cycle. The order failed once. They must not again. The seal was broken once. Not entirely, not fatally, but enough to remind history of what it had been made to forget. And as 2027 draws near, the glyphs align again. The memory stirs. The breath deepens. The gate waits." It wasn't just a timepiece. it wasn't just symbolic. The calendar found beneath the Black Templar site in southern Italy was something else entirely, a relic of rhythm, recursion, and reckoning. Carved not onto paper or parchment, but onto the inner wall of a basalt chamber beneath what used to be a Templar preceptory, the calendar was made of stone spiral and silence. And at its center, a date that hasn't yet passed. June 21st, 2027. Summer solstice. At first glance, the carving resembled any medieval calendar, concentric rings for lunar phases, solar crossings, feast days. But deeper analysis revealed anomalies. Months of unequal length eclipses etched centuries ahead of known calculations, and strange notches next to every fifth crescent, not just astronomical, but musical. As if someone had encoded a rhythm into time itself. And around the spiral, like teeth on a gear, were 33 symbols. Some were astrological recognizable stars and zodiac glyphs. Others were stranger inverted spirals, double crosses, and a motif that had appeared before the mirrored gate. It was discovered in 1989 when a collapsed chapel in Apulia was accidentally breached by a farmer's backhoe. Beneath the rubble was a staircase, and under that, a hidden crypt untouched by centuries. The calendar wall was preserved in almost pristine condition, shielded by volcanic rock and a slow trickle of mineral-rich water that had calcified the chamber like a womb. At the center of the spiral, embedded in a bronze disc, was the seal of the Black Templars, fractured but unmistakable. Scholars dismissed it at first, another symbolic piece of eschatological art, perhaps tied to apocalyptic obsessions, common among late medieval sects. But one Jesuit astronomer, Father Lucian Gault, noticed something unnerving. The lunar nodes on the calendar matched not just past events, but predicted solar eclipses with shocking accuracy right up to the modern age. And then came the anomaly. The spiral ended abruptly, not in chaos, but in perfect echoing symmetry. On June 21, 2027, the markings simply stopped. No collapse, no fade, just a silence in stone. This was not the end of a year. It was the end of a pattern. The outermost ring was framed by 3 phrases in Latin so archaic, it had to be back-translated through Proto-Romance roots. The star returns not as light, but as question. What was drowned does not sleep, and the spiral completes what the sword could not. Each phrase matched a line from prior Templar artifacts. One appeared in the scroll of bound names, another in the heretic map. And the third, what was drowned does not sleep, had been whispered in 1307 by a dying Templar in Avignon, according to inquisitorial notes. If the calendar is a countdown, then the Templars weren't trying to delay time. They were trying to keep us in a holding pattern, spinning around a center they didn't dare let us reach. That might explain why the ciphered calendar was hidden beneath a garrison, known to be unusually disciplined in ritual observance. Templars stationed there followed a 3-day silence. Every equinox refused contact with external commanderies, and were rumored to bury their dead facing west against church custom. One anonymous letter, dated 1326, hints that the calendar was not made by the Templars, but given to them. That its origin was not European. That it came from those who marked time before Babel. The writer claims the spiral is not just a calendar, but a mirror of breath, a rhythm meant to sync the mind with the rhythm beneath rhythm. Wild claims, perhaps. But another detail fuels the mystery. Every Templar preceptory known to house one of the prophecy's components also houses a minor variant of this spiral, etched into corners, woven into floor mosaics, hidden in capitals and frescoes. Always partial, always distorted. Only in Apulia did the full pattern remain intact. Until now. Because shortly after its discovery, the calendar chamber was sealed again, not by accident, but under military authority. The site was closed, the farmer silenced, and the Jesuit astronomer reassigned. The calendar was neither studied further nor shared. Only one photograph exists, smuggled out by a conservationist. In it, the final ring of the spiral glows faintly with calcite and dust. And on the very last groove, one more phrase etched smaller than the rest. If the breath remembers, the gate reopens. It's not a date, it's an instruction. And with June 2027 drawing closer, and the convergence of spiral scroll map and name aligning more tightly than ever, one question remains. Are we nearing the end of a countdown, or the moment we remember what we were told to forget? It was never meant for our time. That much is clear. The prophecy scattered across scrolls, encrypted in seals, hidden in bones and buildings and songs was stitched together, not for the world we live in, but for one that had already started unraveling centuries ago. And yet here we are, its strands converging, its echo tightening into something that almost sounds like a warning or a command. Piece by piece, the secret emerges. The Templars, long reduced to myth and martyrdom, weren't merely guardians of treasure or relics or forgotten gospels. They were timekeepers. Not of minutes or years, but of memory of cycles the world had forgotten how to count. Beneath Jerusalem, what they found wasn't gold. It wasn't the Holy Grail. It was a fragment of rhythm, a recursive signal. Something ancient enough to predate language, yet structured enough to echo in architecture rites and bloodlines. And they feared it. That's why they fractured it. Not to destroy, but to diffuse, to spread the memory across multiple bearer sites and codes so that no one place could ever unleash it. No one person could ever hear the full song. Every site we've explored, Tomar Cyprus, Roslin Apulia, was part of a lattice, a net of forgetfulness. The Black Templars weren't heretics. They were silencers, and still pieces slipped through. The scroll of bound names preserved the last known recipients of the memory, not to praise them, but to prevent them from ever finding each other. The map recorded the sequence of events not in geography, but in time, a timeline of recurrence disguised as travel. The calendar gave us the outer bounds. The initiation rites gave us the inner tone. And the letters, oh the letters, revealed that some still remembered, even as they denied it. But it's not until now, standing at the convergence, that the full meaning flickers into view. The Black Prophecy speaks not of apocalypse, but of release of a moment when the rhythm beneath memory becomes audible again. When the cycle completes not catastrophically, but inevitably. Not because evil triumphs, not because a Messiah returns, but because the spiral was always meant to close. It warns of a moment in history when belief, bloodline, and breath align. When the seal fails not due to sabotage but simply age. And when that happens, the memory will flood back not as knowledge, but as recognition. The end of forgetting. The visions speak of three signs. First, a star returning but distorted, unfamiliar, rising from the wrong direction. Second, a great false resurrection, not of a person, but of a belief system, long thought buried. And third, the drowning of something that cannot sink a city, an idea, perhaps even a species. Sound dramatic? Of course it does. Most prophecies are. But unlike others, this one was never meant to spread. It was written to sleep. So why did the Templars preserve it? Because at its core lies something they weren't willing to lose, a single line that appears in every version of the text, no matter how damaged or encrypted. It reads, "Only those who remember can choose." The prophecy wasn't about control. It was about offering a choice before it's too late to make one. And perhaps that's why we've been finding it now, bit by bit. The timing isn't random. The signs aren't arbitrary. The message isn't a warning of fate, it's a question of readiness. So what do we do with it? Ignore it easy. Convenient. Dismiss it as medieval melodrama. That's what most will do. But the other option is harder. To listen. To treat it not as gospel, but as pattern. Not to obey, but to prepare. To recognize the world's rhythm stuttering. The old beliefs resurfacing. The gates not just of heaven or hell, but of memory trembling. The Templars never expected to survive forever, but they hoped the memory would. That when the time came, someone would remember not just the facts, but the feeling. The pull of something vast, coiled beneath time, waiting not to end us, but to awaken us. And if you're hearing this, truly hearing it perhaps, that someone is you. Before we drift into silence, consider this final fragment once spoken by a dying knight beneath the ruins of Tomar. I carried a shadow not to hide it, but to shape it. We are not the last, only the last before the remembering. The Black Prophecy has spoken. The rest is up to us. You sit now at the edge of something vast. Not a revelation, not quite. More like a breath held in stone for centuries, finally let go. The Black Prophecy was never a script to follow. It was a pressure, a weight behind time itself. And now, as you stare down the final turn of the spiral, something inside you leans forward, not from fear, but recognition. June 21st, 2027 is no longer just a mark on a wall. It's a horizon. Look around. Old systems twitch to life. Forgotten beliefs find new voices. Symbols once buried flicker in architecture, in songs, in dreams you half remember. A strange unease lingers in cities and screens, a whisper beneath headlines. We feel something ending but cannot name what begins. Maybe that's the point. Because this isn't about apocalypse. It's about memory and choice. Maybe the Templars weren't keeping the prophecy from us. Maybe they were keeping us from it until we were ready, until forgetting could no longer protect us, until the breath aligned again. And now it has. So ask yourself not what comes next, but what returns. Not what you believe, but what you remember.